Katey Zeh. I'm a strategist, an educator, and a writer at the intersections of religion and reproductive health, rights, and justice. And in that vein, my story is called Let's Get Frank About Faith and Family Planning. Sex, religion, and politics. Together they form the unholy trinity of impolite conversation. But to paraphrase a television show from my youth, which will show that I am an older millennial, when people stop being polite, they start getting real. There are a few of you who know that show. Which one is it? The Real World. When we dare to talk about sex, we start getting real about our desires. When we dare to talk about religion, we start getting real about our beliefs and our values. And when we dare to talk about politics, we start getting real about our worldviews. So what happens when we decide to talk about all three at the same time? And we put aside those carefully crafted talking points that make us feel so comfortable but that divide us. And instead, we enter into compassionate conversation with those who disagree with us. Nearly 6 years ago, I landed what was then a one-year consulting contract with the United Methodist Church to build from scratch a network of faith leaders in the United States who would advocate publicly for global reproductive health. And not in states like New York or California, in states like Texas and Louisiana and Ohio and Kansas. I found right away that there were two major barriers to the work that I wanted to do. The first was the fear and the reluctance to talk about sexuality in the faith communities where I wanted to work. The second was the fear and reluctance to talk about religion with my secular colleagues with whom I needed and wanted to collaborate with on Capitol Hill. So in order for me to do my work, I had to find a way to assuage those fears. And that meant showing up physically and metaphorically to where folks were and entering into compassionate, understanding conversations with them. But it also meant pushing us past a place of just mutual understanding and respect. It meant pushing us into action, collective action for a more just and compassionate world. So what has that looked like now over the last 6 years? The first thing that I knew I had to do was to change the culture of the church. Because if I wanted us to be that bold prophetic voice talking about global reproductive health, I had to make sure that we had really solid footing to stand on. So I worked for over a year with a team of academics and theologians and clergy and ordinary people in the pews to develop a new policy position for the church that we could take to our legislative body for adoption. And this resolution was a comprehensive framework that was theological and factual and written in a way that would invite conversation in from people along the political spectrum. And we were able to pass that in 2012, which was quite a feat, as you might imagine. But once we had it, we now had this strong language that we could bring into our conversations with policymakers to say without reservation that as a church, we supported women's access to reproductive health, including family planning, because we believe that women have sacred worth. It meant that I could stand in front of the Supreme Court building during the Hobby Lobby hearings, which you all will probably remember, and say that to impose on a woman's ability to access contraception was actually against my own religious liberty. I got to partner with Marie Stopes International and USAID to host a congressional briefing where I stood with my Muslim brother from Afghanistan, and we talked about how our support for reproductive health was founded in our faith, not in spite of it. And this year, my amazing colleague, also named Katie Kraft, has been organizing clergy in 8 states across the country who have been meeting with their representatives to talk about their support for the Reach Every Mother and Child Act, which would help to end preventable maternal and child deaths. There have been a lot of moments like this where we've gotten to shift the public conversation about faith and family planning, but it has not been without tremendous challenges. Many of my brothers and sisters are very reluctant to talk about reproductive health, rights, and justice. They want to talk about poverty, and they want to talk about disease, and they want to talk about human trafficking and climate change. But when it comes to issues like contraception, it's too controversial for them. So our work continues to be about building a relationship with those folks, but also showing them the relationships between the issues that we care about so much. This past summer, we had the opportunity to do what I believe was the very first official conversation at the Sojourners Summit for Change in Washington, D.C. Sojourners is a Christian organization that's known for being incredibly socially conscious. But even for them, these conversations about women's health are very difficult because, as you might have heard, not all Christians are of one mind when it comes to these issues. And so there's a tendency to avoid them altogether. But despite that, we decided to put forward a proposal where we would talk about how do we get beyond the culture wars around contraception. And they reluctantly agreed to let us do this, and we put together a theologically grounded panel. But my favorite thing about that event was after about 10 minutes of opening remarks, the panelists stepped aside, and we let those folks in the rooms have conversation with one another. We were not without critics. In fact, one participant was really offended that we would talk about women's health as if it were a culture war at all. But for all the critics in the room, we were able to have a really compassionate and courageous conversation with each other. And there were folks who were visibly relieved that they finally had a space where they could talk about these issues safely. Dr. Brené Brown, in her book Daring Greatly, says that hope is a function of struggle. And I've seen this to be true, that when we're courageous enough to have those difficult conversations, when we dare to push those boundaries of polite conversation, we gain hope that a more just, compassionate world is possible. I believe that it is, and I pray that it will be. Thank you very much.